Hi folks, Johnny Matthew here. Welcome back to the blog. It's great to have you. If you're new, welcome. If you are not new and you've been before, welcome. You can upgrade and buy me a pint for £5. If you want to be a paid subscriber, that would help. But of course, you're welcome to just enjoy this anyway. So, this is the third and last post in a series of 3 about the Ammanford School stabbings that took place back in April 2024 at a secondary school in West Wales in Carmarthenshire called Dyffryn Amman. So I'm just going to crack right on into this. The two that we've had previously, the first one was really just a quick announcement of the review, the multi-agency professional forum review report. And then the second one were my kind of musings that I'd kind of had before the report came out, asking questions, particularly reflecting on the negative nature of the press coverage, as is often the thing with these sorts of cases. So this one now is having a look at the review report itself and just really a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that it says to give us a bit of a picture, a more full picture, I guess, of what really happened. And it does answer a few of our questions from previous posts. So here we go. Ammanford School stabbings number 3, facts after the musings, and some suggestions to help. Introduction. On 24th of April 2024, about 11 a.m, a 13-year-old stabbed 2 teachers and a fellow pupil at Dyffryn Amman School in Ammanford, Carmarthenshire in West Wales. Mercifully, none of the injuries were life-altering, but one teacher who intervened suffered neck injuries which could so easily have been life-threatening, if not fatal. It was truly awful. Since then, the local Safeguarding Children Board and associated professionals convened a multi-agency professional forum, or an MAPF, and subsequently published a report. There's a link to that in the post. Now, having raised a number of questions in the last post, I wanted to see what, if any, answers we might get from knowing a little more from the report, particularly about the girl involved. So here are some of the questions we raised. What kind of girl was she? What did a good day look like for her? Did she have friends? Could she fit in, or was she isolated? Who liked her? What was she good at? Did she have aspirations or plans for the future? Why was she bullied, and what was done to support her? Why might her father have refused an early help assessment when he later said that he'd asked for help? When were her unusual interests first noticed? By whom, and what was done about that? And what aspects of her presentation caused other people to describe her as being odd? And then, perhaps more importantly, some of the other things we asked were, did she actually ask for help? And if so, what did she think would help her? Was any attempt made to get this help for her? Who did she trust in school? Were there adults she could speak to? Did she speak to anyone? Why did she dress like she did? Did this provide any insight into her internal world? What's her experience of home like? What do we know about why she took a knife to school on this and previous occasions? Has she said why? Why was she not excluded and things escalated given the repeated nature of the behaviour? What was the narrative in the school, in the playground and in the staff room, about her as a person, as a pupil, as a friend, etc.? And on it goes. The questions are legion, as they always are in these cases. And I guess I wrote those questions having read pretty widely across the media world about the incident. And as always, it's kind of slightly salacious, stoking sort of public concern and kind of vilifying the child without really having any idea what the facts were. Anyway, mercifully, the review report gives a bit more balanced understanding and humane summary of her character and experiences. Certainly something the press could learn from. Okay, all about the girl. Insights from the review. In between drafting my initial thoughts on this and publishing it, that's in the second blog post in this series, the review of the incidents was published. That was on 27th of August this year, 2025. Now, without trawling over it all, I thought it was worth listing here some of the findings from the review that give insight into the subjective experience of this young girl. That's the key thing, I think, in here, is that these incidents are very externalized. They are other affecting. They have a massive impact in other people, even to the point of potential life-threatening impact, as in this case. And so the danger is, and is always exemplified in the press coverage, initially at least, that we fall into this, well, this was awful, it was horrific, who is this person, what kind of person would do that, they must be a terrible person, and we get into this cyclical kind of vilifying of the individual without really asking the key questions about what's gone on. So what I'm trying to do here is balance that vilification and those kind of awful conclusions that the press particularly jumped to right at the beginning. So here's a whole series of bullet points. In the text version of this post, I've referenced the pages from the report where I took these comments from. I've made some emphases. Lots of them are verbatim, but the emphases are mine and they're bolded in the text. But I will read them through and then maybe try and do a whistle-stop summary for you. So here we go. This is this girl's experience. She experienced bullying around potential neurodiversity. She showed signs of autism. Low moods, tics, tiptoeing, cracking fingers, self-harming and escapism through made-up stories. Traumatic separation from birth mother, and obviously therefore implicitly parental separation was part of her background. Witnessing violence towards her father from her biological mum's new partner. She apologised to her father afterwards and was extremely distressed about what happened after the incident. Of course, the papers just relayed the fact that she'd done this awful thing and then made a comment about people would now pay attention to her, particularly in the press. So the assumption then is left hanging that this is some kind of egotistical narcissist. Clearly not the case. Extremely distressed. She was quirky, rebellious about uniform, and had difficulties making friends. She had an orange marker for social needs, meaning that she may have had previous emotional behavioural concerns, but was not one of the pupils requiring urgent consideration. This is in a review of children's plans, education plans. She took herself off to an old hall where pupils go at break times with permission from their year head. So it's a place kids can take themselves off to. She didn't have this permission, but went there. So it was kind of an appropriate thing done in an appropriate way. She went to the right place, but she didn't ask permission. Teacher 1, it's one of the victims, removed her from the hall on more than one occasion. The girl challenged this, and the review stated in the victim perspective and reflection section that, quote, it seemed that being allowed to be in the hall was very important to the child. Could she have been allowed to stay in the hall with others? Would that have made her feel safer and have helped her with any social / friendship challenges she may have been experiencing? Unquote. A troubled childhood. Fractured parental relationships. A lack of consistent, secure and stable maternal figure in her life. Exposure to domestic abuse. There were several with police involvement between her birth and being around 8 years old. So the police are at the house because of the violence that's going on there. Her emotional state deteriorated as she progressed through primary school, and she experienced even greater difficulties in her secondary school. adolescence is likely to have added to her pre-existing emotional state. An assessment or specific diagnosis for neurodiversity was not carried out, though a CAMS letter 2 years previously indicated the presence of traits that might be indicative of such. She is described by education staff as capable and academically bright, with no additional learning needs support required. She, quote, struggled in her first secondary school, which was a Welsh-speaking school. She was adamant for some time that she did not wish to learn Welsh and eventually moved to a school where this wasn't required. So she moved from primary school to a school that was inappropriate for her and then had to move again. So she arrives at secondary school long after everybody else and probably didn't integrate very well too. She had unusual interests in war memorabilia, Hitler, fascination with weapons, and purporting to speak German and Russian. She was an army cadet, which her father said she loved, and this may have fed her fascination with things related to war and weapons and conflict and so on, of course. Her father describes her as loving to read, research things, and having a fertile imagination, creating fantasies. A CAMS, that's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, school in-reach consultation. The school described her as showing distinctive behaviours that made her stand out from peers developmentally. So we can see here, without any analysis at all, there's a huge amount going on for this kid. Very little, in fact, almost none of which comes out in any of the press coverage at the time or subsequently. So this girl remains yet another one of these kind of teenage super predators, danger to the public and all that, when in actual fact what you see here is a picture of an extremely troubled child crying out for help. So I'm going to take a really quick breather and then we'll come back and look at some other insights from the review and what we can do to help. All right, other insights from the review. These things I feel may have impacted the outcome, the incident, but are issues separate from the characteristics of the girl herself. So these are things that seem relevant but are not specifically about her as a human being, if you like. Series of bullet points again. Historical behaviours in relation to risk of harm to others were discussed in an initial CAMS assessment in February 22, so over 2 years before the incident. And no further action was taken in relation to this risk. In early 22, so around about the same time, her father completed and returned an autism screening tool which suggested further assessment was indicated. A strategy meeting in October 2023, so over 18 months later, records that the school were going to... The meeting recorded that the school was going to follow this up, but there was no evidence that this had happened. So she was screened as needing assessment for autism, or certainly a neurodevelopmental condition of some kind. And 18 months later, nothing had been done about that. A referral to the government's Prevent programme was discussed but never made, following the first knife incident in September 2023, so about 6-7 months before the main offences. Instead, an early assessment for help, or assessment for early help to better understand her needs, was offered, but her father declined. Nobody seems to have asked why that was the case. There's no information about whether or not she was on a waiting list for an autistic spectrum condition assessment, which is several years long in any case. So even if she was on it, the likelihood between concerns being raised after the screening in 2022 and the incident in early 2024 are practically zero. She certainly wouldn't have bubbled up to the top of a waiting list in that time. Quote, There is a pattern throughout the review of agency records of this child and her father receiving some offers of help and support that were declined or were not followed up. Domestic violence incidents recorded by Children's Services over a 10-year period were considered to be of a lower level and, quote, not viewed as prolific in their frequency, unquote. Children's Services encountered problems with engagement by the father and the child, but the presenting issues were not felt to merit statutory involvement. Father's lack of engagement with early help was not fed back to the central referral team for further analysis. If it had been, a different level of help may have been offered, or, in my view, somebody could have said, well, why is this family refusing help? Specifically, if there's a refusal to allow a home visit, what is that about? That should have posed a red flag for safeguarding professionals all day long. Police took the girl's allegations of bullying seriously and dealt with her appropriately. Agency's assessments and plans do not include input from the mother, and no evidence exists to suggest that this was ever sought. It doesn't say either whether mum was contactable or not, or whether she's been contacted since. It may mean that she was unavailable or nobody knew where she was, of course. Quotes, on occasions, there is evidence of a lack of professional curiosity around child A's presentation, her history, and how it may have been affecting her as an adolescent. Oh, absolutely. This case reeks of a lack of professional curiosity. Overall, the lessons for agencies to learn echo those of a myriad previous inquiries, serious case reviews, and child practice reviews. Obvious blunders. There are some things that should be normal practice but weren't. And also there are things that shouldn't have been in place. That should have been in place, rather, that weren't. So my take on section 8.2 of the report, which flags up transitions, particularly between school, communication and information sharing, and assessments and follow-up actions. So I'll read these two to you. Firstly, transitions. These are always tricky, but information was not passed on between primary and secondary school. The same thing happened again when she changed secondary schools. Remember, she changed from a Welsh secondary to an English-speaking secondary. It's pretty basic. Transitions, particularly school transitions from primary to secondary, are always tricky and developmentally key in my experience. And all the more so when the child has multiple other challenges going on that feed into it all. And having an abortive first move into secondary school compounded this further for this kid. Communication / information sharing. Probably the most recurrent finding in reviews of this kind, education, children's services, CAMS, and the father, all had information that, were it viewed together, could well have triggered better help and maybe even have averted the horrors that followed. Thirdly, assessments and follow-up actions. Quote, direct quote from the report. There are key points when child A's needs could have been comprehensively assessed from a cognitive and emotional health and well-being perspective, to understand what help and support she needed and to ensure any potential risks were managed effectively. Unquote. As well as this, follow-up after and between appointments and when things got defaulted or declined or were transitioned to another agency were also missed. So 3 things there, my take on the Section 8 of the report, some of the recommendations: transitions, communication, information sharing, assessments and follow-up. But here's some other things that I'd like to add to the list of improvements needed. There are 3 here: automatic escalation, singular digital information, fast-tracking specific assessments, and then there's 3 sub-bits to that. So automatic escalation. When cases involve people who, 1, won't engage, 2, fall sub-threshold for prevent, and 3 don't meet muster for safeguarding, there needs to be an automatic multi-agency forum convened with decision-making powers to intervene. In cases of obvious public risk, the police should be included in those discussions. Secondly, singular digital information. Information splitting between different systems always seems to confound matters for obvious reasons. Add agency-specific permissions and things get missed serially. One digital repository for public agency information, police, education, health, social services, youth justice, etc., is the obvious solution. It beats me why we can't do this, If we can take somebody's heart and lungs out and put a second-hand set in to give them another 10 or 20 years of life, why the heck can't we set up a national digital information system that actually works? It beats me. The only challenges then, of course, are data protection implications of a multi-agency access, and you have to get into permission vetting and all the rest of it. But one place with one set of information would mean that the appropriate professionals, if it was managed right, could access all the information relevant much more easily, rather than fall foul of human error, as in this and a myriad other cases, when information is not passed on. And then thirdly, the fast tracking of specific assessments when cases involve potential risk to the public. A faster route to appropriate assessments should be automatic. I've got 3 examples I want to include here. Firstly, risk assessments, clinical ones, not these jumping through the hoops to tick the box ones, but things like the structured assessment of violence risk in youth, the SAVRI, would pull together what's known and guide ongoing decision making. There's information in the text post about that. And of course, it doesn't need necessarily to be the SAVRI, that's a violence specific one, but there are lots of these risk assessments that can guide professional judgment in cases based on what's known about the kid's behaviour. We need access to those. Secondly, neurodiversity assessments. This is fast becoming a regular preach for me and many of my colleagues. But things like the ADOS and ADIR assessments, so professionals trained in these could be available for deployment when a child's presentation suggests that they may be grappling with a different brain. Yeah, I often say to people because of my ADHD, I often say to people, think of it as my brain is just different to yours. It functions differently. So don't make assumptions, because you're making assumptions on the lower ground of a less informed mind because you're working with a different brain. I think forensic CAMS teams, that is forensic, so crime-based, child and adolescent mental health teams across the UK could, and some probably do already, but they could have a work stream that triggers their involvement in cases like these. You see, a waiting list of several years, as in this case, for an ASD assessment, for example, is no use at all. It needs to happen in the next month. And there needs to be a blue light, immediate response with the resources in place to make that happen. I think that could sit really usefully with FCAM's team, which are, in my view, too often purely consultation based. Now that's utterly valuable. I mean, I work in a team like that now, and it's the best job I've ever had. But it needs to be more hands-on, I believe. I don't know what the spread is like around the country, but I think being more hands-on to provide those assessments in cases where there's multi-agency and particularly police concern about the potential for violence or risk to the public or whatever, we need to get stuck in and do those ASD assessments straight away. Waiting list of several years, as I say, as in this case, is absolutely no use at all. So risk assessments, number 1, neurodiversity assessments, number 2, and then thirdly, ring-faced funding for safeguarding. Now, I've lost count how many times I've come across cases which, years ago would have been opened, investigated, and intervened with. Now, in part because funding is so restricted, thresholds have risen and intervention is reluctant. I mean, agencies are forced to select only the most obvious, most pressing referrals for action. And actually, in the worst areas, and I could name a few, but I won't. In the worst areas, there's even some professional pride in batting potential safeguarding cases away. I remember a conversation not very long ago with a very senior person in safeguarding in a big local authority in the UK, who said, "Oh, we're really good at filtering people out of the system, batting cases away. Sometimes we don't stop long enough to look long enough to even do that vetting process very well." So I think agencies, because of the funding issues, they're forced to select only these most obvious and pressing cases for referrals. And teenagers very often fall between the gaps for that, because arguments like, well, it's a teenager, he, she won't engage, or they'll just vote with their feet anyway and not turn up. That's why, and again, another soapbox of mine, teenagers often get the worst deal when it comes to safeguarding. They are presumed to be able to either look after themselves or keep themselves safe in some way, or subvert processes that try and intervene by, quotes, voting with their feet. Gosh, if I had a quid for every time social workers said that to me. I think we need to double down and focus even more on teenagers than we've ever done. I've long felt that youth justice, education, CAMS and the police could work more closely together at the edges of our remits to help mop up cases which risk falling between the stools. Yacht prevention work, MAPAs and MARACs, or multi-agency public protection arrangements and risk assessment conferences, voluntary, charitable and public agencies, police partnerships and others are already doing absolutely brilliant work on a lot of this stuff, and there are fantastic examples of good practice out there. I think we just need to make that the norm and tighten things up, particularly in relation to teenagers and, I have to say, neurodiversity. So final thoughts on this one. My heart goes out to those affected by this shocking incident. It really was terrible. I can only imagine how scary and deeply unsettling it must have been for everybody. That is, the kids who witnessed it, the teachers and the child who was stabbed themselves, of course. I think it was an undertaker who actually intervened, and not undertaker, caretaker who intervened. These folk would have been very affected by it, and one feels deeply for them. The review report, as we've discussed, presents us with a very different child to the one reported in my view, needlessly incendiary and selective press reporting at the time. Indeed, the review described the girl as being, quotes, affected by several adverse childhood experiences, which we know can have a long-term detrimental impact on a young person's emotional, social, and behavioural development, unquote. This was a little girl. Bear in mind she was aged 10 when the first worrying behaviour emerged, who needed help to feel safe, to understand herself and to navigate the world, not least adolescence itself, without harm. And we failed her. As usual, the report lauds the professionals' willingness to learn from all this and work together to avert future tragedies of this type, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course. But to my ear, this is just more echo, more tired old rhetoric, more future orientation to take us away from the sadness and guilt as quickly as possible. Now, on a human level, I totally get that. But on a professional level, we need to do better. The plain truth is, we need to see children as children. We need to meet their needs and ensure their safety. In short, we need to do whatever it takes and spend whatever it costs to help kids develop well and fulfill their potential. Because as Richard Rohr has it in the quote image attached to this post, quote, if we do not respond to our pain, if we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmitted. I think that's what happened in Ysgol Dyffryn Amman. I hope that's helpful. As usual, tons more information in the text post. Thanks, guys. I will see you in the next one.